All right, let's pray. God, we give you thanks for the chance to study Mark and for the chance to be together again on a Wednesday. We ask, God, for you to bless our time together and all that we do so that we might uncover all the message you have for us in your story. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're going to do the Gospel of Mark in this session of these studies. There's 6 sessions in this study, so we're doing it 6 weeks, and we're doing kind of dividing up. We won't read through the entire Gospel every verse. There'll be some sections we'll skip because they're transition times, or they repeat some of the themes we're going to discuss other places. So you'll notice as we study this in these sessions that you're going to have some opportunities to read other parts of Mark's Gospel. Your study guide that you have there, the first week has a lot of fill-ins because I'm kind of set the stage for Mark's Gospel today. And there's a lot of information, and some of you will be very excited because I'm going to geek out a little bit on some of this stuff today, and some of you will be like, "Oh my gosh, here we go again." But after this, every other session, the next 5 sessions, are going to be a really kind of reading the text and talking about the story of the Gospel of Mark. And so in your guide that goes with this study, you have basically the print of the text of the Gospel on each of those other sessions that we're going to look at. So there's not a lot of fill-ins for those times, but there's spaces for you to kind of write notes in between as we talk about them. So there's a little bit in the beginning that we're going to kind of talk about. And do that. So we've called this study of Mark, Do You Not Get It? Do You Still Not Get It? And it comes from this verse from Mark 8:17 from the Message version, which says, meanwhile the disciples were finding fault with each other because they had forgotten to bring bread. And Jesus overheard and said, why are you fussing because you forgot to bring bread? Don't you see the point of all of this? Don't you get it at all? This happened right after Jesus had fed kind of the multitudes and talked about things and all the other stuff were going on, and he's starting to do all these miracles and starting to feed people and starting to take care of people and starting to do all this stuff. And the disciples are kind of arguing that they don't have enough to take care of themselves. They don't have enough to get by. And Jesus says, do you still not get it that I'm enough to get by, that you don't need anything else? So, and it really sets the stage for the Gospel of Mark, because the Gospel of Mark is really an understanding of kind of exploring the idea of people not quite getting what Jesus was talking about. That's Mark's real point of this whole thing. The disciples don't get it from the beginning to the end. The crowds don't get it. There's a lot of that kind of repetitive kind of idea happening throughout the Gospel of Mark. So we're going to look at those stories each time as we go through the next 6 weeks of the study of Mark. So week 1 is, each week's going to be a title about what you don't get, and this one is, you don't get any Christmas stories. It's about the astounding beginning of Mark. So I have a little bit of icebreaker at the beginning of this, each of our sessions that I'm going to do, and so I wanted to kind of share kind of things, and if you're watching online, I want you to kind of think about this. What is the best news that you have ever received? What's the best news you've ever received? Anybody want to share? We had to talk about grandkids earlier when we first got in. I've been talking about their grandkids. That's always grandparents are usually pretty excited about that. So that's how it goes. I don't have that yet.
There's too many of them. I couldn't narrow it down.
Yeah, we get good news. Good news is the thing. That becomes an important kind of thing for us to think about. Is what's the best news we've ever received? Because that's going to kind of set the stage for Mark's Gospel. So the book is one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus. The early historic traditions kind of link this book with a scribe named Mark, or also called John Mark. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Who was a co-worker of Paul and a close partner with Peter. That's kind of where we get these stories. The gospel stories, each of them are going to be named for people who either why they were written or where they were beginning to be written was because they're either people who had a first-hand account of the life of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, or were closely related to someone who had that first-hand account. Is that person that they were related to, like Peter started to near the end of his life and threatened of the martyrdom and all that kind of stuff, they started to see the wisdom of being able to write down these stories that people that they told because they lived them, and so that's kind of why the Gospels came into being and how to do that. So there's an ancient church historian named Papias who said that Mark collected the eyewitnesses' account of Peter and shaped them into this account that's in the Gospel. So that's why we get the idea that Peter is kind of where Mark gets this. So the goal of the study that we're going to do is that to demonstrate that Mark didn't randomly assemble all of these kind of stories in this account. He very carefully designed them. Gospels, one of the things we should know is that Gospels are never meant to give a chronological account of the life of Jesus. It's not like flipping through Jesus' baby book where he kind of goes through the thing and you learn when he lost his first tooth and when all that kind of stuff. It's not like that at all. It's meant to kind of tell the meaning behind the story. It's more than just so. For instance, Mark's gospel and other gospels do too. They tend to gather miracle stories together or parable stories together or things like that. Not that Jesus was in his my miracle phase, so I'll go around doing miracles for this next 6 months, and then next 6 months I'm in my parable phase, and that's not how Jesus lived his life, of course. So all that stuff kind of happened intertwined, but the gospel writers kind of organized them that way to be able to tell us a greater story. So in the first line, Mark claims that who Jesus is. He says, this is the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So right from the start, that's where he starts. And that's why I asked the question, what's the best news you ever received? But it's interesting is that's the only time that Mark actually says what he thinks about who Jesus is. The rest of the time, it explores this idea of people not quite getting it. So for the rest of the book, the author of Mark hopes to influence you by simply putting Jesus' actions and words in front of you and showing kind of how other people react to him. So let's look at kind of setting it up. The New Testament Gospels were written in the late 1st century, so the timing of these things was that the Gospel of Mark, we think, was written first. We'll talk a little bit more about that again, around 70 CE or AD, and shortly thereafter. And then Matthew and Luke were written between 80 and 85. They were the next one. And then the Gospel of John was the last one written in the early 90s of our Common Era. So that's kind of where that goes. And there's reasons why we date them this way. I didn't organize my slides. Needs to be corrected there. Okay. There are three main things. There's the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and most scholars believe that the Gospels contain Jesus' prophecies about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which occurred in 70 CE, and argue that these prophecies were added after the event happened. Also, the Markan priority, the idea that the widespread scholarly view, as we'll discuss as I geek out on all this kind of stuff that I get excited about a little bit later, that Mark was the first gospel written, and Matthew and Luke used Mark and another source to be able to do that. That's what I think. And then the spreading of the gospel is the third reason why that's there. They began to be widely disseminated in the 2nd century, but evidence placed their writings in the 1st century. So they started to really kind of make the people started to, as they traded and did sailed around the world and did different things like that and traveled on camels and all the other stuff they did in those days. They started to really carry these copies of these Gospels to other cultures and other places, and we start to see them show up everywhere. There's some important considerations for this. First of all, these are anonymous documents, really. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are added to the Gospels later. They weren't. That's who they were attributed to by the early church. The earliest manuscripts are simply anonymous. They're not given an author. And there's reasons why they're given the names they're given, and reasons why they're attributed to those people. But it's not. It's not. Originally, it wasn't there. They became important for these Gospels to link again to either somebody who's with Jesus or who was with those who were with Jesus. There's also some varying views about all this stuff. While that 70 to 100 age range or date range is kind of important, That's kind of the scholarly consensus. Some conservative scholars may date the Gospels even earlier than that, because think about this: if we take the date that we divide history into the before Christ, BC, and AD, year of our Lord, we take that date as 0 when Jesus was born, which is debatable historically, right? But if we do that, then Jesus would have died about 33 AD, which meant that it would have been 35 more years before the Gospels were starting to be written. So that all of that stuff would have been kind of without a written document between that time. It would have kind of been more oral condition, transmission, and all that kind of stuff. The real idea here becomes this two-source kind of hypothesis that scholars kind of look up with the Gospels and how we understand the Gospels, and why I'm doing Mark's Gospel here. Is that scholars tend to think there were two key sources into how the Gospels were written, especially the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. First is there was Mark as a source. Mark is considered the earliest Gospel. It provided the narrative and the basic order for both Matthew and Luke. It's accepted that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark for their shared stories in chronology, and it's sometimes called a kind of a way in which those things came. The other source is this source called Q, or Quell. This is a hypothetical document that scholars believe contained the sayings of Jesus. It's believed to be the source of the passages that appear in both Matthew and Luke, but are not found in Mark. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. Again, we said you don't get any Christmas stories in this Gospel. There's no Christmas stories. There's none of that stuff. As we'll discover at the end, there's no post-resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Mark. And so there's this idea that there were things that were out there that Matthew and Luke used that weren't in Mark, and so they give it the name Q, or Quell. The Q material is an idea that is there. Q comes from the German Quell, which means source, so that's why they call it Q. And it's the shared sayings of Jesus that are not found in Mark. Now, this two-source hypothesis attempts to resolve what we call the synoptic problem. Now, this is a weird seminary word I'm going to give you right here. Synoptic problem is that the synoptic Gospels, the ones who look with each other, are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, as you read the Gospels, John is a total different animal. It tells different versions. It talks about different things. It has things in it that are out there. It was written. It's just different. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. They're the ones who look with each other at these stories. And in fact, in seminary, you get a book called the Gospel Parallels, which is a big blue book about like this that you flip through, and it's got Matthew. It's got 3 columns: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and every story that's in there, it lines them up next to each other, so you can see where every one of them comes. So these are stories that kind of go with you and all that kind of stuff. Now, like I said, this is where I kind of geek out on you. So if you don't like the stuff, just kind of tune out for a while, or scrub through the online if you're watching it there. But the role of Mark and Q in Matthew and Luke, in these two sources, explains this two different this stuff that's in the two Gospels, but not in Mark. There's a couple traditions that go there. There's a triple tradition, which means that there's a material that appears in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is generally attributed to the authors of Matthew and Luke, drawn from the Gospel of Mark. So it's Mark is the source, Matthew and Luke kind of draw from there. And then there's material that appears, like I said, both in those 2 Gospels that comes from a different source, and that's why they give it that name. There are, because Q is a hypothetical document that we don't have any reference to, we don't have any way of knowing that it's there, scholars have kind of deduced that it's what's there. And it kind of becomes important to kind of Now, there are those who dispute its existence, who don't think it really was. And there are other reasons why we do that. We'll look at some other theories that are out there of why there are stories in Mark and that are not, there are stories in Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. So other theories beyond these these two-source hypothesis that have to understand how we do that. So there's this thing called the Ferrer hypothesis, which says that basically the sequence is this: the Gospel of Mark was written first. Matthew used Mark as a source, but then Luke used both Mark and Matthew as a source. So he's not, because of the dating of what we said and when they were written, this guy was not willing to say that Matthew and Luke they didn't know each other. That Matthew was written first, so Luke would have known Mark and Matthew, and so he would have used both sources, and that's why he says that. So there's no hypothetical Q sources out there. It's just that's how that goes. So. There you go. So the strength of that is that it does avoid that hypothetical Q thing. The weakness is that questions are like, why, if Luke is using Matthew, why would he have omitted some prominent sections such as the Sermon on the Mount and really kind of changing up some of the birth narratives and all that kind of stuff? All that stuff is different. And if you notice during Advent, during Christmas time, when we read those stories, we read them, when you read them from different Gospels, the shepherds are in one, the wise men are in another, there's all that kind of stuff. And why would they change that up if they were using each other as source? So anyway, there's also the two gospel hypothesis. This theory is named for this guy named Griesbach, who says that Matthew was written first. That's why it's first in our Bibles, it's written first. The sequence was Matthew was written first, followed by Luke, who used Matthew as a source, and Mark was written last and used both Matthew and Luke, but created an abbreviated version. So that's his theory of why that happens. Why would the weakness, I think, of that one is why would Mark shorten it up? It's kind of a strange one. There's something called the Augustinian hypothesis, named for St. Augustine, who believed that this was the chronological order, that Matthew was written first, Mark used Matthew, and Luke used both Matthew and Mark. So it's kind of that same thing we were talking about before. So it's kind of there, like that Griesbach theory we talked about before. It's there. They kind of propose different orders for Mark and Luke. So in one it's Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, and then in another it's Matthew, then Luke, then Mark. So it's a strange thing, and people have argued about this all the time. There's an oral tradition hypothesis, which means that, like I was talking about earlier, that the only reason there's similarities is because these became the traditions, the oral traditions that were being told to everybody all around, and so they begin to understand that. So, so because these oral traditions were passed down, they began to be kind of understand that. So the understanding there is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke grew independently from all these well-known oral traditions and kind of wrote their own kind of versions of the stories. So that's kind of thing. Then the last one there is this thing called the Streeter hypothesis. This is kind of an expansion on the two-source hypothesis that was the original one we talked about, and named for this guy named Streeter in 1924, so really recent in the grand scheme of things, right? It accepts Mark and Q as sources for both Matthew and Luke. In addition, it gives the idea that there are two more sources called M and L, named for stuff that's just in Matthew and nowhere else, and stuff that's just in Luke but nowhere else. And so all these people kind of come up with all these theories, and in some ways, like I said, it's interesting to me. I spent an undergraduate and a graduate degree studying this kind of stuff because it's exciting. It's kind of great to look at and kind of what's happening. But in the grand scheme of things, whatever order they came in, whatever order we understand it, has some bearing on how we interpret it. But it really kind of helps us kind of understand. It doesn't help us understand the story ultimately, so it's just kind of there. So let's look at the Gospel of Mark kind of as a whole instead of this thing. I'm done kind of in the weeds now for a while, so we'll get back to Mark. So I'm certain most of you are like, thank you. All right. So Mark is a gospel story in 3 acts. It's 3 acts. The first act is Jesus in Galilee. First 8 chapters of Mark, everyone is amazed and wondering who Jesus is. It includes a kind of a summary of Jesus' core messages about he went around Galilee announcing the good news that the kingdom of God is here. Jesus is kind of we're carrying forth the message of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, and kind of looking at that. So the story kind of set up there that in this beginning of this gospel, that Jesus, through Jesus, is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil. And Jesus invites us to live into this reign and follow him as a disciple. That's kind of the beginning of the gospel. This act includes a series of stories that showcase Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom into reality. He goes around healing people whose bodies are broken, or sick, or they're under possession, spiritual kind of possession. He even does something that for Jewish people, only God has the authority to do. He forgives sins. And so it really kind of sets up the stage. And these kind of things, there's a lot of different responses to this part of these stories, as we'll cover as we read them together. Many people become his disciples and follow him, while others don't know what to think. And so there's kind of this kind of dichotomy that's happening right there. Some totally reject him, like the leaders of Israel, who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. Jesus isn't surprised by these responses. He even draws attention to them in several places throughout Mark's gospel. In chapter 4, we get a collection of many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of the kingdom of God. The parable of the soil and the seed and all those kind of things, a mustard seed, all these kind of things where it's kind of something small and something grows, and he kind of is planting an idea in our minds according to Mark's gospel and how he talks about it. The growing confusion starts here at the beginning of this act, this first act, about Jesus among the crowd, and it's kind of an important part of the story that Mark starts to emphasize in the first part, of the first act of Mark's gospel. Even among Jesus' disciples, there are many occasions when they're really just kind of confused about him. Act 2 is Jesus on the move. In Act 2, the disciples struggle to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. Jesus takes his disciples aside at one point in this and says, who do people say that I am? And that's when Peter says, you are the Messiah. But it becomes clear really soon that Peter doesn't really get what that means. He just kind of has heard that and repeats that, and doesn't really understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And so that goes kind of an important thing. But the disciples just start to really not to get it. They think that following Jesus is going to give them fame and importance. Who's going to sit at the right hand and the left hand and all that kind of stuff, and things start to happen in the second act. But Jesus makes it clear that following him is like dying and taking up your cross and all that kind of stuff. So Jesus has this conversation several times in this second act of Mark's gospel, and culminates in a statement, which is one of my favorite statements in the gospel. My favorite statement in the Gospel of Mark is, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant, to give his life as a ransom for many. It's kind of the Mark 10:45 is kind of a real important verse in the understanding of Mark's gospel. But the disciples, they still don't quite get what Jesus is talking about. So at one point, Jesus in this act takes three of his disciples up the Mount of Transfiguration, we call it, and he's suddenly transformed in front of them and radiates light and all this kind of stuff, and they start going, oh, we should build tents and we should do this and we should do that, and Jesus is like, no, you don't get it, you don't get what's going on here, and really kind of challenges them to kind of know all of that. So it's kind of the beginning of that kind of story. As we'll look at that, Jesus on the move. And the last act of Mark's Gospel, act number 3, is Jesus in Jerusalem. We kind of begin to see the interesting way that Jesus becomes king. It's not what you think a Messianic king is going to be. It's not going to rule. It's going to be a crown of thorns and not a throne but a cross and all that kind of stuff. And Jesus kind of makes his public royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover, and enters the temple and the courtyard, and asserts his royal authority by throwing out the people scamming and profiting off of worshipers. And that whole week of this Act 3 is kind of Jesus in Jerusalem for Holy Week, and kind of has that. It all leads up to that final night when Jesus shares his Passover meal with his disciples, and then goes to the cross and dies there. There's a resurrection story at the end of Mark's gospel that kind of just ends. And it's abrupt ending. We'll look at that, and at the end of our last session, we'll kind of look at the abrupt ending of Mark. And there's also, if you look in your Bibles, there's probably a longer ending to the Gospel of Mark that's disputed about whether or not that was originally a part of Mark's Gospel or not. It doesn't seem to fit with Mark's Gospel, and kind of seems to almost be like somebody was trying to, because Mark kind of sets the stage for the whole Gospel of saying, you don't get it? Why do you not get this? And people not getting it. Even at the end, the women who go to the tomb don't get it, we'll discover. And then these last kind of verses of Mark's Gospel that we think may have been added really kind of wrap things up real nice and neat. And try to explain it all away at the end. And it just kind of, it doesn't really fit. So most people don't think it was a part of the original Gospel of Mark. So as I said, who wrote the book of Mark? Well, the earliest historical traditions link the book to a Christian scribe named Mark or John Mark. And again, somebody who worked with Paul, with Peter, and early disciples, and went around and probably started writing down the stories they were starting to tell. The context of the story is that it's that around as Jesus moves around Galilee and Samaria and all these kind of parts of the world. When you go to the Holy Land, when I went to the Holy Land many years ago, it's very interesting because what we did was that we first went to Galilee, and we stayed in a hotel in Galilee, and we got to go around the Sea of Galilee and see all these sights and do all this stuff, and got on a boat on the Sea of Galilee and do all this stuff. And then for the end of our trip, we were in the old city of Jerusalem. And so it was kind of like, almost like we were following kind of what the Gospels tell Jesus of him being in Galilee and the places he went. And we went to some of those places and even out from Galilee. And then to go into Jerusalem at the end, kind of, it was a neat kind of experience to think about the fact that you're kind of in the midst of all that stuff. So it kind of is interesting. The Gospel of Mark is one of my favorite books in the Bible. My favorite gospel account. When I was in seminary, we had to take a book where we got real intense in studying a book of the Bible, and I took the Gospel of Mark as my book because I really like it. I call Mark's Gospel kind of just the facts, ma'am version of the gospel stories. There's no embellishment. There's no kind of what's going on. There's no greater story. There's not very little interaction. It's like Jesus does this, and he moves to the next thing, and he moves to the next thing, and it's not explaining a lot of things away, which sometimes for me is helpful because some of the explanations get more confusing than just the stories that are there, and are often misinterpreted, in my estimation, more than just the stories that are there. If we would do more with just what's there, we would be better off, I think. So I've called this study Mark, You Don't Get It, and it's based on that verse that where Jesus says to his disciples, you still don't get it. And we're going to look at that kind of thing. So each week we'll examine something that Mark's Gospel says you don't get, and so the goal by the end of this study is that we will maybe get it a little bit better. So like I said, right from the start, the Gospel of Mark, unlike Matthew and Luke, contains no Christmas stories, no narrative about Jesus' birth. While Matthew and Luke include those stories, Jesus begins in Bethlehem, goes to Egypt, all this other stuff, and anything else. Mark's narrative begins abruptly with the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and then immediately shifts to John the Baptist's work and the temptation of Jesus and all that kind of stuff. And that's there. So Mark starts with Jesus as an adult, around 30 years old, and focuses on what Jesus does, on his ministry, not on how he got there, but what he did while he was in ministry. That's why I've called it, You Don't Get Any Christmas Stories in this session. So let's look at Mark's gospel reading, Mark 1 through 13. And you should have that, I think, in your guide there. So I'm going to read that to us. This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, God's Son. It happened just as it was written about it in the prophecy of Isaiah. Look, I am sending my messenger before you. He will prepare your way, a voice shouting in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make his path straight. So right from the start, Mark begins that's the way he ties it back into the Old Testament story, is that there's a prophecy. That verse right there is kind of comes out of verse 3, kind of comes out of a look at what the prophecy from Isaiah and all that stuff. And then it says that who's doing that? Well, it says that John the Baptist was in the wilderness calling for people to be baptized to show that they were changing their hearts and lives and wanted God to forgive their sins. Everyone in Judea and all the people of Jerusalem went out to the Jordan River and were being baptized by John as they confessed their sins. John wore clothes made of camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist. He ate locusts and wild honey. He announced, "One stronger than I am is coming after me. I am not even worthy to bend over and loosen the strap of his sandals." That's a really specific kind of a statement that we make there, because one of the things that you did when you were a servant in a household is that when someone came into your house, you untied their sandals and washed their feet. And so John the Baptist is not just saying some random story. He's saying, I'm not even worthy to be his servant, to wash his feet if he walked into my house, kind of stuff. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. About that time, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and John baptized him in the Jordan River. While he was coming up out of the water, Jesus saw heaven splitting open and the Spirit like a dove coming down on him. And there was a voice from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness. In you I am well pleased." This is a lot more common translation. And at once the Spirit forced Jesus out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan. He was among the wild animals, and the angels took care of him. So, right from the start, there are 3 events that happen in this story that are important. It highlights key events that help us understand begin to grasp the setting for Jesus' ministry. It talks about John the Baptist's ministry. Who was John the Baptizer, and why was his ministry significant? He was there to prepare others for what Jesus was doing. In other words, for Mark, this was so confusing that you were not going to get it, that you needed to have someone who would kind of prepare you for this. Because if you just came at it cold, you really weren't going to get it. So it became important that the stress that John the Baptist was involved in there. And so he there to prepare others to the good news of Jesus. He records Jesus' baptism. Why was Jesus baptized? And why does Mark include this event? Especially considering the main theme of the book of not getting it. Well, I think this question gets asked of us preachers a lot of times. Why would Jesus get baptized? He was without sin. Right? Well, for us as United Methodists, baptism is not a baptism for the forgiveness of sins. That's not why we do it. It's a part of what goes on there. But the baptism that we do, and the reason we baptize infants and baptize anybody at any age, is that it marks the beginning of the journey, and it says more about who God is than it does about us. We declare who God is when we baptize somebody. And we're declaring who God is in their life. And so for Jesus to be baptized by John was a statement about who God was in Jesus' life and there. That's why Mark tells that story of the angel, the voice, Jesus hearing that. Now that will become important later on, because there'll be another time when a voice is heard almost saying the same kind of thing, and it just kind of bookends this whole kind of discussion of what's going on with Jesus. And then the last thing, Coles, is that's supposed to be Jesus' temptation, not Jesus in Galilee. Sorry, Jesus' temptation. How did God respond from heaven to Jesus' baptism? The text says immediately the Spirit sent Jesus out in the wilderness to face temptations from Satan. Why did Mark organize this book around these for events? I think because he's kind of setting us up for these things are important. We're preparing the way. We're declaring who God is in the midst of this, and we're declaring that even that Jesus gets it, and that's why he's able to resist the temptations of all things that are going on. So I think that becomes an important thing. So some key aspects of Mark's opening. There it focuses on his ministry. He skips details like the virgin birth, the journey to Bethlehem, the star, the shepherds, the wise men. It starts with Jesus' public ministry. Mark's primary goal is to focus on the person and work of Christ during his adult life rather than the events of his birth. This idea reflects for Mark that the gospel is not about the Christ child, but about his mission. So it focuses on his ministry, not his infancy. Other key, I think, is Mark's rapid fire style that starts to happen. There are no there's not much time to catch your breath when you read the Gospel of Mark. Sometimes when we read a novel or a book, we kind of have, or watch a TV, there's a commercial break and we have some downtime and we kind of, we catch our breath and we go on for the action ramps up again. There's not much time for that throughout Mark's Gospel. It's kind of rapid fire, boom, 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 right? One thing to the next. And that becomes important because it really kind of, again, is just the facts, just the basic kind of presentation of the Gospel. He jumps right into to the action rather than focus on the early years when Jesus was growing up. The question that gets asked all the time from all the other Gospels that include birth narratives, Matthew and Luke, is the idea of, where was Jesus from the time he was a kid to the time he was an adult? We don't know much about Jesus that time. Other than that verse, Luke 2:52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with people. We don't know much about it. It's just kind of there. What was he like? And so you get all the cartoons about Jesus doing miracles on the family pet and stuff like that when he was a kid and all that kind of stuff that happened. But we just don't know about Jesus and what he was like as a kid or anything else. So it allows us to have a lot of conversations. For Mark, those things weren't important. What was important was this is what Jesus did when he came onto the scene. When he was released for his ministry, he started to do this. There's also a different theological focus at play here. Mark's omission of the birth narrative reflect the idea that there's a different priority compared to Matthew and Luke. This gospel emphasizes Jesus' identity as a Messiah through his encounter with John the Baptist and his subsequent miracles, rather than through the circumstances of his birth. One of the things that when we discuss the Gospels and we start looking at them, we start looking at not only when they were written, but we start looking at the audience they were written to. And Matthew was written to a very Jewish audience. That's why it starts with Matthew 1 has the genealogies at the very beginning. And those birth narratives become important because it establishes the family line of Jesus in line with all the other Jewish stories that went back and as we study Old Testament books. Luke was more of an academic. We think he was kind of a physician is kind of what he's kind of commonly known as, but he's probably more intelligent kind of guy. But he's writing to a more educated Gentile kind of audience. Mark is the first gospel I think is written to kind of set the stage for all this stuff. I do believe that Mark was written earliest, whether other people used it or not. I think it was written first, and I think because of that, I think it really kind of sets up for us understanding that that he was kind of trying to prove a point about Jesus, and it became his identity became not because he was born into a certain family and a certain set of stories. He did these amazing things. And how could you look at Jesus heal people and do 4 miracles and listen to his teaching and not think he was somebody special? And I think that's where Mark does. So you'll notice that Mark concentrates on John the Baptist's role and his baptism and divine affirmation that starts right from the start. So that begins there. So that declaration right at the beginning of Mark's gospel about the declaration of this is the beginning of the good news of about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And then John the Baptist preparing the way. That I think is why that becomes that beginning. What does this story begin? It's the beginning of the good news. This is kind of the I think when Mark was writing his gospel, if it was indeed the earliest gospel, there were a lot of people who heard stories about Jesus, but weren't quite sure. Really? This guy did this? He performed these miracles? He taught in these ways? And I think that's why he writes it this way, to understand, to give people permission to ask those questions and give people permission to not always get it what happens. And that's one of the things I like about Mark's gospel, is that even not only from the beginning, but even to the end of the story, as we'll uncover if we read the end of that, the women go to the tomb and find out Jesus is resurrected, and it's not like they go back and tell the disciples, and then Peter and John race to the tomb, and those are other gospel accounts, right? In Mark's gospel, it says, and they went away afraid, and they didn't say anything to anybody because they didn't get it. And so, from the beginning of Mark's gospel to the end of Mark's gospel, people just don't quite get it, and I think that's why So I think that confusion, that sense of thing, that Mark giving permission for people to live into that kind of way is important. So Mark deliberately frames the story of Jesus with the highest possible claim about Jesus from the very beginning. And so he sets up the central irony that the main characters are going to struggle to grasp that truth. So Mark is for me, is my favorite gospel because it really kind of allows you to explore kind of the story without all the other stuff that gets in the way sometimes of this. And sometimes when we hear the Christmas story, I always say that as a preacher, I never really read from the King James Version. That was never a part of my tradition that I read from, except for on Christmas. And you got to read it the way Linus reads it. Because everybody hears the Christmas story the way Linus reads it. And so if you don't read the King James Version, you don't hear that version. That's not what you hear. And so people go, wait a minute, that's not how that story goes. Yes, it is. It's just not the King James Version of that story. And that's what he reads, that's what he tells, and so that's what we tend to read on that night, is kind of that version. But I think for me, the Gospel of Mark really is a great way of looking at things, and I don't get bogged into those with that Christmas story and that Linus kind of version of that. I don't get bogged into, well, this is what I've always thought about this as much when I read Mark's Gospel as I do with some of the other stuff. So that's the Gospel of Mark. That's kind of the academic kind of look at Mark's Gospel. What we do now, what this is, and when I wanted to do this first because I kind of wanted to set the stage for this. Now we just read the Gospel of Mark together and kind of talk about individual stories in the midst of this. So this study is not, I'm not going to do a lot of this kind of stuff in this study. It's going to kind of more be a chance for us to look at the story and kind of ask ourselves some important questions and think about what that is. So my recommendation is, if you've never read the Gospel of Mark, that you might do that. You can read it from this version that I've given to you in your book, or you can read it from whatever version of the Bible you read when you do your reading, whatever sounds good to your ear or your eye, looks good to your eye. But I would encourage you to read that and kind of think about that. You don't have to do it all at once if you don't want to read that much over the next little bit, but you'll look at if you look at your guide, you'll look at kind of what's there for each week and what kind of gives us an opportunity to kind of look at what we're going to talk about. So you might want to read ahead kind of a little bit, kind of look at that, so that you can ask questions or kind of come up with things that you're going to talk about. So. Okay. Any questions about Mark's Gospel?
don't have a question about it. I mean, I have lots of questions, but when you were setting out the three events, you know, the baptism, the John preparing the way, the baptism, and then temptation, I thought that's kind of how our walk goes.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody presents the gospel to us, we accept it, we get baptized, and immediately temptation is right there. You know.
Right. You think, well, now that I'm in, my life's going to be really easy.
Right.
No. That's not the story of the Bible. That's not the story of the Gospels, of any gospel. But it's really not the experience for most of us as followers of Jesus. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's good. That's good. I like that. So, yeah.
And then we have work to do, right? I mean, that's what
Yes.
Jesus says. I
That's
mean,
what-
he gets the temptation, and then he sets out to do
Then he starts to do it, and that's what Mark really kind of concentrates on throughout this gospel. Yeah.
If you read Acts in the letters, you always get the sense they're expecting Jesus every day.
Yeah.
You think that's probably why Mark is written the way it's written, because it's still that immediate, he uses the word immediate over
Right.
and over and over again.
Right. Yeah.
So that he's focusing only on the most important things, because although they reached the point where everybody's scattered, because
Right. It wasn't going to happen.
Judea's in revolt, right? So
Right.
it's not going to happen the way they thought, but it was a way to capture, because everybody was scattering and
Right.
they
Okay.
needed the most immediate facts. Because the others tend to go back to
Yeah. I
more
think
and more, let's prove who Jesus was.
Yeah, I think
later.
there's some of that stuff. I think it's also the fact that that Mark is also writing to the people who were kind of in the midst of this, and it wasn't necessarily to be. Matthew writing the way he does about the birth narratives and the genealogy and everything else is almost like I'm trying to convince my Jewish audience that this is who Jesus is.
Yeah.
Mark's not trying to really, he's just kind of giving it to you. This is what it is. I mean, he's not trying to, it's not as, I won't say it's not evangelistic, but that's not the intent that Mark has to do that. He's just kind of saying,
But you got all the apostles who are passing away,
Right.
and you've still got all these Christian churches that have been established. Who's presenting the gospel to them anymore?
right.
If you don't write it down.
If you don't write it down. And probably what happened is, if this is John Mark, if it's follower Peter, if that's it, probably what happened is that when these apostles would go to these churches and visit them and talk to them, they'd probably sit down and go, there was one time when that Jesus said this, and there was one time when Jesus did this, and it was very kind of just matter of fact about things. And they go, oh, that was great to hear what Jesus did. It wasn't that I needed to have a lot of extra in there, because I'm telling you what. So if John Mark is a follower of Peter and a scribe, kind of an idea of writing down some of this stuff, he's writing down these stories and not necessarily, also not feeling the need to add anything to these stories, because there were, if he's earliest, then there were other apostles who were around who could still tell those stories, and so I want to make sure I get Peter's, so yeah, there's a lot of it that's kind of, I think, in Mark's gospel, though.